Hi, my name is Emily DeMarco, and I'm going to explain to you the case between Emma, Mrs. Potts, and Mr. Jones. Emma showed up at the office covered in gauze and in pain from an accident that was still unknown to us. Emma seemed scared and very emotionally guarded. She was carrying an official looking document in her hand and asked to speak to a lawyer for advice. As a paralegal at the law firm, I took the reins and decided to have the initial interview. Um, To help Emma feel comfortable, I assured her that everything she said was confidential and would only be discussed with the lawyer associated to her case. I had simple but straightforward questions, a set of questions that allowed Emma to answer with ease. The interview was client controlled, so I asked questions that she would be able to um, kind of expand on, so long as she felt comfortable doing so. And when Emma struggled to answer some of the questions, I backtracked and repeated some things that she had already mentioned, kind of in order to get the interview to keep flowing as is. Um, Emma explained that on a cold and rainy day, she decided it was the perfect day to go eat at her favorite restaurant, the Hot Spoon. The great thing about the Hot Spoon was that you could bring your pets with you and put them in the play area while Emma could enjoy her favorite clam chowder soup, um, while her dog played outside in the play area. However, when she sat down with her bowl of soup, she heard a loud crash. As she looked behind her, there was Mrs. Potts sliding across the floor, trying to regain her balance. And when she looked like she was starting to regain her balance, she smashed right into Emma's table, and clam chowder covered Emma with burns, over 15% of her body. Um, Unfortunately, so she burned over 15% of her body, and she was out of work for nearly a month. Um, and not only did Emma get burnt, but her dog Horton heard the loud crash, and he heard Emma screaming, his owner. So Horton jumped over the barriers somehow, and he bit Mrs. Potts on the derriere. Mrs. Potts filed a lawsuit against Emma and for not supervising her dog Horton, causing Mrs. Potts injuries. And with my assistance, um, I think we should file a cross complaint against Mrs. Potts, solely because Emma holds no responsibility. I mean, and which I'll explain to you later. Um, we are seeking $200,000 in damages for Emma under the theory of joint and several liability. So when we go into negotiations, we want to avoid court first. We want to try to settle this outside of court, not only for money, but also for um, just for time's sake, because we could spend a lot of money in court over litigation. So after my client and I filed a cross complaint against Mrs. Potts, it's time to prepare for the negotiations. So my ultimate goal with my client is to settle this outside of court, as I mentioned, um, due to the fact that it will be less costly for my client as well as her time. We don't want to waste her time. So attempting negotiations will allow me to see how flexible opposing counsel will be, and it will help me prepare for the next step, given how negotiations go. After conducting research, I discovered that the Driscolltown Ordinance 1-0012 states that all restaurants elected to have dedicated play areas for the pets owned by patrons shall have a barrier constructed along the length of said enclosures of a height not less than 3 feet, but no more than 6 feet. I also found that the Hot Spoon's pet enclosure was only 2 feet 10 inches. So that's a huge factor, because learning this information, we are going to present it in negotiations as Mr. Jones was the one at fault for not having the correct barrier enclosures for the pets. My client Emma wouldn't have gone to the Hot Spoon with her dog knowing that he did not have up to standards barriers for the dogs. Also that day, um, no wet floor warning sign was posted. So when Miss Potts took her fall, so she had no idea there was a spill there or a cleanup, whatever it was. Um, my goal is to show opposing counsel that Emma couldn't have possibly known that these events would have happened, and I would present these. Facts differently to Mr. Jones rather than Mrs. Potts, because I want to present it to Mrs. Potts in a way that shows her, listen, Emma had no idea that the barriers in the hot spoon were not up to standards. She would not have gone knowing that these standards were not up to date or up to standard. And also that there was no wet floor signs, and Emma couldn't control that there was no wet floor signs, and she had to suffer the consequences. She has burns over 15% of her body. She was out of work for over a month, in which she needs to be compensated for. And I think presenting this to Mrs. Potts in this way will kind of shift her blame from Emma towards Mr. Jones. And when we present this to Mr. Jones, we want to say, listen, 2 of your customers were injured greatly. For one, because the wet floor sign was not presented, and 2, because the dog barriers were not up to standard. And this caused Mrs. Potts to have a dog bite, and this caused Emma to have burned over 15% of her body from steaming clam chowder all over her. And back to Mrs. Potts, she suffered a broken finger. Mr. Jones would see that all of this responsibility is on him. Mrs. Potts will see that, and Emma will hopefully get $200,000 worth of damages to cover for what she has suffered. So now going into mediation, if negotiations didn't go well, Mrs. Potts didn't want to settle with negotiations, so we have to kind of move towards mediation. The great thing about mediation is that each of my clients can explain their side of it, right? So we know Mrs. Potts was injured. We know Emma was injured. Well, how about Mr. Jones? So I think if we do mediation for all 3 at once, Mr. Jones will see that the injuries that he caused for both parties, and we're hoping that if Emma kind of proves to Mrs. Potts that she was not responsible for what happened, she got damaged because she got injuries, it will kind of help show that Mrs. Potts should lift all of the whole lawsuit up against Emma and put it all on Mr. Jones. And Mr. Jones and Mrs. Potts will pay up for the injuries that they caused. I'm thinking in mediation, if they can't decide on something, I think it would help if Emma lifted the lawsuit. So I think if we showed that Emma is willing to make compromises, Mrs. Potts will make compromises, and then Mr. Jones will feel responsible for the entire incident, and he will be willing to compensate both parties. If mediation doesn't go well, arbitration will be our next step. Arbitration, it's going to be a little difficult, because if Mrs. Potts is not willing to settle or not willing to take back the lawsuit against Emma, we're going to have to kind of, give her the responsibility to show the responsibility that Mrs. Potts had in Emma's burns. And so not only will we show that Mr. Jones did not have a wet floor sign, and Mr. Jones did not have the right dog barriers, that, he holds all responsibility. And because Mrs. Potts has not lifted the lawsuit against Emma, we will show that she was not trying to move away from Emma. She she went towards Emma to try to have someone to help her stop from falling, and it caused Emma's injuries, burns over 15% of her body. And so that is how I would present it to negotiation, mediation, and arbitration. We're presenting the facts. We're showing that Emma did not hold responsibility. We tried to negotiate with Mrs. Potts and Mr. Jones, explaining to them, the damages that Emma suffered in negotiations, moving to negotiations. We are trying to negotiate a deal. Emma is willing to lift the lawsuit against both of them, kind of compromise. Mr. Jones and Mrs. Potts was not willing to negotiate at this, or not willing to compromise at this point. So the next step is arbitration, and we're going to present to the arbitrator, the facts of Mr. Jones was not responsible at his shop. He did not have the right barriers. He did not have the wet floor signs when there was a wet floor. And we're also going to show that Mrs. Potts did not try to stay away from other customers to prevent hurting anybody else. And because of that, she fell into Emma's soup, and Emma burned over 15% of her body. So, in presenting all these things in negotiation, mediation, and arbitration, I think the opposing parties, I think Mrs. Potts is going to show that Emma's dog Horton was not, Emma was not watching her dog. And that's how she's going to present it to Emma. She's going to say that Emma was responsible, Emma wasn't watching the dog, and Emma let Horton bite her. That is how it's going to be presented, and we will have to, show them that Emma had no idea that the barriers for the dogs were not up to standards, and she couldn't have known that Horton was going to be able to escape because she had just assumed everything was up to standards. And for Mr. Jones, I can't imagine how he's going to present. I can only assume that he's going to say, he thought his barriers were up to standard. The person who put the barriers up told them they were up to standards. And that's his, wrongdoing for not knowing 100%. And also that he did not, maybe put it on his employees, that his employees did not put up the wet floor sign. And so he couldn't have known that there was a spill and that this would have happened. So I think that's kind of like from each perspective, from Mrs. Jones and from Mrs. Potts, that, how they would present it to me. And so I'm in hopes that Emma will receive $200,000 in damages, either from just Mr. Jones or from both Mr. Jones and Mrs. Potts.